So I'm going to introduce our panelists to you. Firstly, Diana Dalton, who's the Deputy Director and Head of Gender Inequalities at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, with responsibility for gender equality, gender-based violence, child protection, LGBT+ rights, disability inclusion and social protection. Her many previous roles at DFID include heading up their operation in Bangladesh, and she's also worked for VSO and International Save the Children Alliance. And then secondly, Claire Ambrose, who is a social development advisor and lead on the new programme supporting women's rights organisations and movements. She has led this work since April 2020. Previous roles have included Deputy Head of the former DFID Gender Equality Team and Policy Lead on Violence Against Children.
Great, thank you. Can we get the slide pack up, please? Right, I'm going to get a bit of a crick in my neck, just trying to refer to my notes and also back to the slides. So apologies if it doesn't look particularly fluid, but I'm really pleased to have the chance to come here today and talk you through the key elements of our strategy. We are really pleased to have got this out. It's been quite a long time in the cooking. We've had to undergo some political changes that have interrupted the flow of progress, as you all know. So it's a real relief to be able to say it's published, and now we are obviously into implementation phase. So what I'm going to do is summarize the main elements of the strategy, because I mean, hopefully you've all had a look at it. If you haven't read it in detail, please do, because obviously all I can do is really give the headlines today. But there's a lot packed into a relatively short document, and I'm sure that as organizations with slightly different focus areas, there'll be something in it that you will like to have a longer conversation about with the various FCDO staff who are here today. So please take that opportunity to dig into the detail later on. I wanted to start by saying why we've published this now, apart from the fact that it was finally the right political moment to do it. As you know, we became a merged organisation of the Department for International Development with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in September 2020. And that presented very clear new opportunities to do more and have greater impact on human rights, on inequality, on exclusion, particularly of women and girls. And it's really important that as a government department, we are really clear to others exactly what that means in all of our international work. And I know that organisations like yours scrutinise and watch very carefully. So we have tried to take on board the feedback that we've had from you over the months in preparing for this, because we completely recognise that we are not doing this alone. We do this very much in partnership with many others all around the world, with international governments right down to grassroots actors. Second, it's particularly timely because we're seeing a very real and increasing threat that is effective in undermining the rights of women and girls, and indeed potentially rolling back the progress that many of us have worked hard towards over recent decades. So could I have the next slide, please? Right, next one after that, please. So in terms of the global context, sorry, I'm going to have to just get the slide up to refer to that. Yeah, it might be easier actually. Thanks. This one at the bottom. Right, there you go. Sorry about that. So just in terms of that geopolitical context, we've tried to reflect the fact that we are in a changing world. It's a complex geopolitical landscape. There's increasing authoritarianism, there are concerted and very well organised attempts to roll back on rights. And the UK is very keen to seek to build more middle ground partnerships. There are multiple crises. We ourselves at FCDO have spent a lot of time focused on the COVID pandemic, the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, successive humanitarian disasters, economic shocks that have resulted from all of those, and obviously there are conflicts and the impacts of climate change around the world, and all of those affect women and girls disproportionately. Rapid technological change, innovation brings huge opportunities to close the gender gap, but the ever-growing threats to women and girls that are present from as a result of digital exclusion, increasing cybersecurity, online harms and threats are growing, and more women who enter public life, for example, find themselves subjected to much higher and really worrying levels of online violence and harassment. And we are, one of the things I expect to be said today is, what do you really think about intersectionality? So it is something that is implicit in the strategy, and we really recognise that women and girls are subject, when they're subjected to being marginalised in other ways. For example, they are very poor, they live with a disability, they belong to a minority ethnic group, or they're geographically remote, or they're a member of the LGBT+ community, they are subject to even more marginalisation, sometimes persecution and exclusion. And then obviously at the current rate, we know that the gender gap will take longer to be closed. So now is the time for us to be working together. So we can't really afford, any of us, to be inactive on this agenda. Supporting girls to secure their rights, to be free, to fulfill their potential socially, economically and politically is the only sensible thing for the world to do. It boosts prosperity and trade, it strengthens global security, and it builds resilience to economic and environmental shocks. The new strategy does, of course, build on the UK's international commitment and leadership over the many years on many interconnecting aspects of gender equality. It may be from supporting and championing SRHR, promoting global action to achieve 12 years of quality education for girls, to showing the world that violence is preventable against women and girls is preventable through our What Works programme. So you'll be asking what's new about the strategy, and could you move on to the next slide, please? We essentially have framed it through 5 principles, 3 thematic priorities and 3 goals. So I'm hoping that you can remember that framing. The idea is that it will be a framing that will certainly stick in the minds of our staff, if it doesn't for you guys. But that's, I think it's really important to talk first about the 5 principles, because they're really important in showing how we're trying to respond to the current context and seize the opportunities that are present at the moment. And they are, could you please go on to the next slide? The first one is to more vocally stand up and speak out for women and girls' rights and freedoms on the global stage and in our bilateral relationships. And the primary aim of that is really to build those networks and effective shared strategies with others to counter the rollback on rights that I talked about. The next slide, please. Number 2 is championing, difficult word to say, women's rights organisations. And I'm pleased that Claire will be able to say a lot more about that after I've finished talking today. We are supportive and want to be proactive through our policy work and also our funding to build up the capacity of women's rights organisations and movements. And the aim of that is for them to be instrumental as decision makers at the international, national and local level. It's not to prioritise them as recipients of assistance, it's to build the capacity of the organisations themselves to support them to do their work as advocates in service delivery and as frontline responders in crises. Next slide, please. targeted investment. This is really about getting the most back, the greatest return on the efforts and the funding put in. And so we are looking, what's new definitely about this strategy is that we are looking across the life stages of women and girls to secure the greatest lifelong intergenerational impact. So that's early years, foundational learning, key interventions at the stages of adolescence where women and girls fall out of school into different roles in the household and so on, and then support their meaningful transition to work and economic activity. Next slide, please. So as I said before, we have already, a lot of us spent our time supporting women who are most adversely affected by crises and shocks. They're most disproportionately affected, particularly if they're already marginalized in other ways. And we've already been doing a lot of this in Afghanistan, in Ukraine. It's a priority. We anticipate it requiring concerted focus and effort going forward. Next slide, please. And then alongside all of this, it's so important to stay focused on what sustainable development will look like. And that means we have to look at the political, the economic, and the social systems at the macro and the micro level that play such a critical role in removing the barriers that stop women and girls participating fully, and which also have a really critical role in protecting and empowering them. Next slide, please. So I've put all of the 3 E's, which we've talked about many times before with you, onto one slide, because what I don't want to do today is go into the depth of what's captured in the 3 E's. You can read that in the strategy. They are educating girls, empowering women and girls with a particular reference to the importance of sexual reproductive health and rights, and ending gender-based violence. So there's such a lot that sits under that. We have multiple teams around the organization that are focused on those areas, but I just wanted to emphasize the fact that we still have a multifaceted approach thematically across the interconnected thematic priorities. And then finally, the 3 goals. Next slide, please. And one more, thanks. So this is really where we have galvanized action across the organization and tried to capture the main headline commitments that will be delivered by the organization between now and 2030. And the first of those is to use the UK's influence and convening power to really drive that conversation on the importance of progressing and continuing to stay focused on progressing, not reversing the rights of women and girls, as those who come together become effective in trying to roll back on the rights of women and girls. It has to be matched with an even more concerted effort to continue to progress. We do have a new campaign hashtag, which you'll probably have seen, of rights, freedom, potential, and we will open up space through our posts at country level, in bilateral relationships, and on the international stage as part of that communications campaign. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a bit. Next slide, please. Our second goal is around leading by example, and that really sets out what the UK itself will deliver through its programs and how it will measure its own progress. Acknowledged again, of course, that we work with many other partners in this. We are not an implementer, we work through others, but notably in there is a commitment of at least 80% of FCDO's bilateral aid programs having a focus on gender equality by 2030. We can talk, I expect that will come up a little bit later, we can talk a bit more about that. But it's the reason we've focused on that target is because it's signaling our commitment to mainstreaming a focus on women and girls across all efforts, all teams, all investments, all policy work. Next slide, please. And the third goal is leading through knowledge. The UK has such a lot to offer already on this as a global good, both in terms of the technical assistance that it's made available and its expertise, the bank of evidence it's generated over time, and it continues to generate through primary independent rigorous research. And we have ambitious plans to do more, including a new women and girls research strategy. Next slide, please. I just wanted to say a little bit more in conclusion about this campaign theme, because quite rightly you would say, well, what exactly is that and what does it mean? It's really important for us that we don't see the launch as a sort of end point, you know, well, we've got it out, we don't really need to worry, we'll just get on with a few things and it'll sit there and we'll occasionally refer back to it. This is very much the starting point of a bigger effort by the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And I can say that genuinely because we've been quite bowled over by the Foreign Secretary's own commitment and interest in this. It was he who came to us to say, I want to go to Sierra Leone, which is, and particularly to Bo, where his mother was born, to launch the Women and Girls strategies. So that energy really came, well, we obviously did lots of lobbying beforehand. They really picked up on it. And we feel that we've got that real commitment from ministers. He's written to every single head of mission and every senior leader inside the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office to say, I need you to prioritize this. This is a priority to me. And I don't know whether you're picking up in the media, but the Development Minister and African Minister, Andrew Mitchell, is really keen to state very clearly how the UK will regain that traction and reputation as a real leader in international development. There are 7 themes. One of those is women and girls. So we're really delighted that it's really getting leverage. Obviously, those of us who work on these issues feel very strongly about that. So in terms of the campaign, it will be about ministers' voice and action. It'll be a focus at events in the international calendar. So the SDG Summit, the International Conference on Population and Development next year. We have UK generated events that we are organising ourselves. The Wilton Park series is one of them. I know some of you will be invited to those. There is already a programme of official level strategic engagement on rollback with like-minded countries, but also embracing those who are more in the movable middle ground. We obviously will want to be accounting for delivery under the 3 E's and telling the stories about what has been achieved. And there'll be a really significant effort to support posts. So the network of 283 offices that the FCDO has around the world, for them to do more. Some are really brilliant and already really active. Some are saying, right, what do we do? How can you help us? So we're really hoping that you'll see an amplification of all of these themes at a country level. So next slide, please. That's all from me. I'm going to stop there, and I'm not sure what happens next. Questions or hand over to Claire? Hand over. Right, there you go.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Claire Ambrose in our Gender Equality Hub, and I'm leading our work on the new Women's Rights Organisations programme. And I just wanted to start by saying I'm so pleased to be here and be able to finally talk about it. This programme has been a very long time coming, and the announcement was delayed because it was tied to the Women and Girls strategy. So I think, you know, we would have liked to have been here last year talking about it. But anyway, here we are, and it's just a really, really good moment finally to be talking about it. I also wanted to say a big thank you to all of you, because I think it is something, so I'm very passionate about this, but I think also there's a lot of very passionate people in civil society that for a long time have called for that core, flexible, multi-year support to women's rights organisations. And in a time where there are ODA budgets can be challenging, this has been something that has been prioritised, and we're really lucky. And I think it's in part due to practically every PQ letter that comes in, etc. It's really emphasising that point. So it really is fantastic to have got here, and thank you for that. Picking up on what Diana said about the prominence of women's rights organisations in the strategy, that is obviously absolutely fantastic. I propose to talk about our programme here, but in the breakout group, we'll pick up more widely our work around sort of broader sort of support and increased engagement with women's rights organisations and movements. I'm going to provide an overview, firstly sort of setting out in slightly more detail kind of how we got to this point, an overview of the programme, but then I want to leave enough time for questions both for the strategy and on the programme. So first of all, I guess kind of taking a step back, how did we get here? So we were very lucky to have time to conduct a sort of thorough review of the evidence, but also to consult, including with Women's Fund, with women's rights organisations, key umbrella organisations, other bilateral donors and thought leaders, to really understand what was most needed in this space and where we as FCDO could best add value. And the core findings from that were that, first of all, it is that need for the core multi-year flexible funding for grassroots women's rights organisations. This needs to include support for women's rights organisations and movements, provide capacity building or accompaniment, which is the best term, support organisations working in conflict and crisis contexts, and importantly, take an intersectional approach. We considered a sort of breadth versus depth question. Should we focus on a few countries or should we work broadly? And the feedback was to adopt breadth. If you focus in too much, then that can create some over-reliance, and we work in a political system where continued funding is not always guaranteed. And then there's also a question about, should we be setting something up or should we be supporting an existing initiative? And the latter was preferable, so that the majority of funding can go to grant making rather than sort of the complicated time and admin costs involved in setting up a new initiative. And so I think rightly so, the bulk of the funding is sort of going to that grant making. There are two additional components that came out of the consultation. The first one was identified that women's rights organisations representatives, women human rights defenders struggle to access and meaningfully participate in key decision-making fora and policy engagement. And so we have two components focused on that will allow us to combine development spend with diplomatic levers and the geographical presence. So Diana noted 283 posts across the globe. So an advocacy and a knowledge component, which I will come on to in more detail. Finally, in terms of geographical scope, picking up on that breadth versus depth question, the breadth of this programme is going to be working across all ODA eligible countries. And I think, like, finally, the key point that I want to really emphasise in terms of the approach is that it's very kind of values driven. We're being really careful to adopt that, thinking about shifting power and resources, not setting thematic focus, really recognising that local organisations are best placed to determine what's most needed to achieve change, and also learning from the past few years, thinking COVID, Ukraine, I mean, it's all happened. Those organisations also need the flexibility to be able to pivot when whatever happens, happens. So moving on, next slide, please. I need to get synced with the slides. Could we go to, that is just, sorry, if we could just go back one, please. So that is the overview then. 6 years, 3 components, sort of as I just touched on. So it's £38 million in total. The grant making is the largest component, 33 million, and then 5 million for the advocacy and knowledge components. And then I've covered those 2 points already. We could move on to the next slide, please. So the main focus of the programme, grant making, as I said, the focus is to strengthen the effectiveness and sustainability of women's rights organisations and movements. And this is being delivered through a partnership with the Equality Fund. For those of you not aware, so the Equality Fund, it's an international women's fund based in Canada. It's global in focus. It has 3 arms, so a gender lens investment arm. It crowds in philanthropic funding, both to support and try and create a sustainable funding flow for the core grant making function. It also adopts a very strong intersectional focus. It's very values driven and is very deliberate about sort of wanting to shift the power. And that sustainability point, I would also sort of really emphasize in the consultation, we were really aware that at the time 38 million or 33 going to the grant making feels like a really significant amount, and of taxpayers' money that is a really significant amount. But in 5-10 years time, and in comparison to the need, it really is still a drop in the ocean, particularly when you get into that multi-year funding. The number of organizations that you can support really reduces. So therefore, thinking about the sustainability and trying to make that funding really work, and so work collaboratively with other funding initiatives and different types of donors was a really key aspect. In terms of that sort of shifting the power piece, I would say that so we as FCDO, we do not sit on the board and approve the grant making docket. The grants are instead decided via a participatory grant making method, and this varies depending on the stream, and they're also trialing different methods to be able to do that at greater scale. To then sort of dive into the detail and share a little bit about the different grant making approaches. So as I say, there are 4 streams. The first 2 women's rights organisations working at the local level, and that's working across all ODA eligible countries. The second is 2 women's funds, both at the national and regional, and sometimes at the international level. So for example, the Urgent Action Trust Fund, for example, to then onwards grant to women's rights organisations, really recognising the strategic importance of building that women's fund ecosystem and the sort of the important role they play in that. Thirdly, funding to feminist networks and consortia to accelerate movement building. And here I think like a good example is say Gender and Climate, but you'll all be well aware of the many like other sort of opportunity around that and the need for that type of funding. Then finally, women's rights organisations in crisis contexts, both to strengthen their ability to respond to natural disasters and armed conflict, but also to engage in the global humanitarian system. And so that policy piece, so that's not rapid response, but that's the policy piece, which through our consultation came back as really important. And as I say, so our funding has gone into the grant making side, but in terms of the activities, we're also trying to encourage additional philanthropic support, recognizing that you know, there's a fantastic opportunity there. And so, for example, 2 weeks ago, Minister Mitchell announced the Equality Fund partnership at a summit with philanthropists. Moving on then, so that's the main component, as I say. We have 2 additional ones. So first of all, advocacy. So supporting grassroots women's attendance and meaningful participation in key national, regional and international fora. And in terms of support to enable meaningful participation, this could include, for example, translation assistance, protection, funds to network with other organisations in advance. Then a knowledge component, so supporting the production and dissemination of policy relevant products that reflect the priorities and knowledge of women and girls at the grassroots to inform more inclusive and representative policy development. And again, the scope for both of these is all ODA eligible countries. And this is being delivered by a consortium led by Genderlinks. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with them, but they're a South African-based women's rights organisation working in collaboration with Arrow, a Malaysian-based women's rights organisation, and then also with a small input from Mannion Daniels. Just to provide a little bit more detail about both of these components. So on the advocacy side, this is going to be co-created during inception phase, and this sort of comes back to that values point. We really recognise that we shouldn't be sort of sitting initially and sort of setting all of this out. The kind of the co-creation and the consultation would be really important for this. So as I say, co-created with the consortium that I just explained, alongside an independent advisory committee comprised of a range of women's funds, organisations, convening networks of women's rights organisations and other actors, also in consultation with women's rights organisations. And the plan is to identify key advocacy moments globally, regionally and nationally across the development, conflict and humanitarian spectrum. And examples, it could include, say, multilateral meetings, thinking around the likes of the G7, UN at that level, regional, say, for example, African Union, and then national, and also including the opportunity to engage with posts, really recognizing that we now, as a merged organisation in particular, we have a lot of diplomatic levers available, but very often lack that nimble funding to be able to make the most of those opportunities. It could also cover women's participation in peace processes at the national or regional level as well. There's going to be an accreditation process for significant events. And then in terms of, I guess, the strategy, there'll be a tiered approach. So firstly, identifying large events for which there would be that accreditation process. And then secondly, having flexible, responsive funding to facilitate attendance at key events and meetings that sort of are more kind of organic in nature and that can't be anticipated in advance. And again, I think this is really learning from the past few years. And, you know, you can sort of try and identify strategies, but you also need to be kind of nimble and able to adapt. There'll be criteria developed to assess the applications for the flexible responsive funding element to ensure there's a real strategic need for representation, that other donors or initiatives are not prioritising the same events, so sort of making the support duplicative. The proposed attendee is appropriate at the technical and political influencing level, and to avoid any attendance being tokenistic. And the aim is to give priority to events where funding from other sources is either not available or it's harder to secure. I touched on it a little bit, but there'll also be funding to ensure attendees can meaningfully participate. Again, this is going to be fully agreed during co-creation phase, but it could include funding to strategize with other key bodies and organizations in advance, translation assistance, visas, public speaking skills training, or thinking around measures to assist with security. Next slide, please. The last slide. Finally then, so just to provide a little bit more detail on the knowledge component. So again, this will adopt a broad focus on gender equality, but different themes within that will be considered as appropriate. And by that, well, I'll come on to that in a second, but this is also going to be co-created for the same reasons as previously by the consortium in consultation with that independent advisory committee and women's rights organisations in inception phase, based on a review of the evidence gaps and collective priorities. Again, the proposal is to adopt a tiered strategic approach. So first of all, thinking about the overarching strategy for the length of the programme with some key evidence questions to be answered. Then thinking about annual priorities with the ability to flex if circumstances require. And then finally, rapid reviews, but with criteria to be developed to establish the type of issues that could form part of the rapid review. Issues that could be considered could include key trends and imperatives that women's rights organisations and movements are going to be contending with going forward. So, for example, climate conflict, cyber, future pandemics, and shorter-term reactive pieces could be rapid reviews, for example, around how women and girls are impacted by a particular crisis or excluded from meaningful participation. We're really aware of the need to ensure that diverse, so emphasising that intersectional approach, women's views are captured, and also the products are designed and disseminated effectively so that they're listened to by policymakers. When I talk about product, this is going to depend on what's most appropriate for the situation. So, for example, a webinar might be appropriate for a rapid turnaround, shorter piece of work, or a sort of report or evidence brief for something longer term. Finally, they're going to be public goods, so available both to FCDO, but also wider donors, funders, civil society, multilaterals, etc.